Welcome to the 14th Hong Xiu Ching lecture in the Hong Xiu Ching Speaker and Seminar Series. My name is Kanti Bajpai, and I'm Director of the Center on Asia and Globalization, one of the 4 research centers of the Kuan School of Public Policy. The theme of this session, as you know, is how to thrive in the age of acceleration. Our main speaker is Tom Friedman of the New York Times. Tom will speak for about 40 minutes before sitting down to a conversation and a Q&A. Tom was involved in a very similar session some years ago at the school, I recall with great pleasure, and it's wonderful to have him back in our midst. The session also features our very own Kishore Mehbubani, currently Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute, or ARI, which is located in the main campus of NUS. Kishore will engage Tom in conversation after the lecture and moderate the Q&A thereafter. Tom Friedman is the foreign affairs columnist of the New York Times. His column reports on US domestic politics and foreign policy, Middle East conflicts, international economics, environment, biodiversity, and energy, and it doesn't seem to leave a whole lot else. But Tom has won the Pulitzer Prize 3 times for his work at the Times. In addition, in 2004, he was awarded the Overseas Press Club Award for Lifetime Achievement and the honorary title Order of the British Empire, OBE, by Queen Elizabeth II. Tom's the author of several books. You're going to recognize a lot of these titles, but I'm going to run them past you just to give you a sense of how prolific he is. From Beirut to Jerusalem, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, arguably the one that really had the greatest impact and really introduced him to a wider reading public. Longitudes and Attitudes, Exploring the World After September 11. The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century, another a title that's almost passed into common parlance. Hot, Flat, and Crowded, That Used to Be Us, How America Fell Behind in the World We Invented and How We Can Come Back. And his latest book is Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist Guide to Thriving in the Age of Acceleration 2.0, which was released in 2017. Kishore Mehbubani is currently Distinguished Fellow, as I said, at ARI, over in the main campus. He was twice Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and was president of the UN Security Council in 2001 and 2002. He was also permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1993 to 1998. In recognition of his services, Kishore was conferred the Public Administration Medal, Gold, by the Singapore government in 1998. Kishore latterly, perhaps more famously, if that's possible, was the founding dean of the Kuan School of Public Policy from 2004 to 2017, and was a professor in the practice of public policy from 2006 to 2019. In April 2019, he was elected as an honorary international member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Kishore, too, is a prolific author. His books include Can Asians Think?, Beyond the Age of Innocence, The New Asian Hemisphere, more lately, The Great Convergence, Can Singapore Survive?, The ASEAN Miracle, Has the West Lost It? All of these are now kind of very evocative and provocative memes almost that we have. His latest book is on China-US relations and will be published shortly. Our session is titled How to Thrive in the Age of Acceleration. You may have seen an abstract of the talk, but let me draw on it briefly just to set the stage. And I quote, "The world is being reshaped by 3 simultaneous accelerations in technology, globalization, and climate change. To thrive in today's world as a worker, a company, a community, or a nation state requires learning how to adapt to all 3 at once. The lecture will explore how we undertake these adaptations, who is doing it well, what it means for education, politics, business, and geopolitics." Before I give the floor to our distinguished speakers, let me say a few words about the Hong Xiu Ching lecture series. The series is funded by a generous gift from Mr. Tay Liam Wee, former CEO and Group Managing Director, Sincere Watch. The speaker and seminar series is named in honor of Mr. Tay's late mother, Hong Xiu Ching. Speakers in the series have included Andrew Sheng, former chairman of the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission, Takehiko Nakao, president of the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, the Vuri Subbarao, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Richard Zeckhauser, professor of behavioral economics, Harvard Kennedy School, Moses Naim, former editor of Foreign Policy magazine, Rebecca Santa Maria, currently executive director of the APEC Secretariat, and earlier this year, Mari Pangestu, a professor of international economics, University of Indonesia, and former Indonesian Minister for Trade, as well as tourism and creative economy. We've had Asian and non-Asian speakers in the series. The series have dealt with an array of topics, including trade and finance, global public goods, Asian geopolitics, and ASEAN. Today's talk touches on issues that are vital for these uncertain times, and I can't think of two people better placed to help us think about those times and how we should operate in this new area, in this new era. Thank you both for agreeing to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Tom Friedman and Kishore Mehbubani.
Connie, thank you. It's great to be back here at NUS and great to share the stage with my longtime and dear friend Kishore Mahbubani. So Kishore, thank you. I'm going to talk for the next 40 minutes or so about my last book, Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Acceleration. First question I get from people when they hear the title of the book is, from where comes the title, Thank You for Being Late. It actually comes from meeting people in Washington, D.C., where I live, for breakfast. And every once in a while, someone comes 15 minutes late. They say, Tom, I'm really sorry, it was the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. And about 5 years ago, Peter Corcell, an energy entrepreneur, came to breakfast 15 minutes late and did the, Tom, I'm really sorry, it was the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. And I just spontaneously said to him, actually, Peter, thank you for being late. Because you were late, I've been eavesdropping on their conversation. Fascinating. I've been people watching the lobby. Fantastic. And best of all, I just connected two ideas I've been struggling with for a month. So thank you for being late. Well, people started to get into it. They'd say, well, you're welcome. Because they understood I was actually giving them permission to pause, to slow down, to reflect. And that's why my favorite quote from the front of the book is from my teacher and friend Dov Seidman, who likes to say, when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, it starts. That's when it starts to reflect, rethink, and reimagine. And boy, don't we need to be doing a lot of that today. Because our world isn't just changing, it is being reshaped by three giant accelerations all happening at the same time. And that's what this book is about. It's about these accelerations and how they are reshaping politics, geopolitics, the workplace, ethics, and community. So let me see if I can condense all of that in the next 40 minutes. So one of my teachers, Lynn Wells, likes to say, never think in the box. Today you must never think out of the box. Today you must think without a box. And what I'm going to show you in my talk is how I think about the world entirely without a box. Because I think if you aren't melding three perspectives at the same time, what's going on in climate change, technology, and globalization, you will not understand the world today. Because as I said, we're in the middle of three nonlinear accelerations all at the same time. So I'm just going to skip a couple of slides here. So first we're at acceleration, what I call Mother Nature. Mother Nature is climate change, biodiversity loss, and population growth in the developing world. If you put Mother Nature on a graph or a picture right now, she looks like Glacier National Park 1913 and Glacier National Park 2012. By the way, that glacier was there for 7,000 years. If you put Mother Nature on a graph, she looks like a Lake Chad 1963, and Lake Chad's that little blue smudge down there, 2013. If you put Mother Nature on a graph, she looks like an accelerating hockey stick of global average temperature and what's happening to it. Put Mother Nature on another graph, she looks like another accelerating hockey stick, reported instances of extreme weather since 1988. And put Mother Nature on a graph, she looks like the mother of all hockey sticks, global population growth through history. Put Mother Nature on a graph today, she's just one accelerating hockey stick after another. The market for me is globalization, but not your grandfather's globalization. That was containers on ships and planes. What's actually globalizing the world today, knitting it together, is digital globalization. Everything's being digitized and globalized through Facebook and PayPal and MOOCs, etc. Put digital globalization on a graph and it looks like another set of hockey sticks. Total data consumption per month, or mobile cellular subscriptions in the United States, or Singapore, or Cambodia, or Venezuela. They all look like a hockey stick. Global internet users, another hockey stick. Put digital globalization on any graph you want, and it's a series of accelerating hockey sticks. And lastly is Moore's Law, coined in 1965 by Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, who posited that the speed and power of microchips would double every 2 years, and the price would stay roughly the same. Put Moore's Law on a graph, and it looks like one giant hockey stick. Now, Moore's Law has actually been in place now for 54 years. And every year during the last 54 years, someone's written a story saying, Moore's Law is over, Moore's Law is over, Moore's Law is over. And what all those authors have in common is they were all wrong. Moore's Law is alive and well. This PowerPoint, I assume, is running on an Intel 14 nanometer chip. It has 35 million transistors per square millimeter. 2 years ago, Intel began shipping its 10 nanometer chip. It has 100 million transistors per square millimeter. And Intel can tell you exactly how they're going to make their 7 nanometer chip. A few years ago, in fact, Intel decided to try to demonstrate the power of Moore's Law's acceleration. They asked their engineers to take a 1971 Volkswagen Beetle and try to calculate what if this Volkswagen Beetle had improved at the same rate that microchips had since 1971. And Intel's engineers concluded that if that had been the case, that Volkswagen Beetle today would go 300,000 miles an hour. It would get 2 million miles per gallon, and it would cost you 4 cents. You would be able to drive it your entire life on a single tank of gas. That's the power of the technological acceleration driving our lives. Friends, we're in the middle of 3 hockey sticks all at the same time. And they aren't just changing your world. They are reshaping your world. Now, another way I like to describe what we're going through is we're actually going through 3 climate changes at once. We're going through a change in the climate of the climate. We're going from what I call later to now. So when I was growing up in Minnesota in the 1950s, later was when I could clean that river, purify that lake, rescue that orangutan. I can do it now, I can do it later. Today, later is officially over. Whatever you're going to save, please save it now, because later will be too late. Later is over. That is a climate change. We're going through a change in the climate of globalization. We're going from a world that was interconnected to a world that's interdependent. And when that happens, you get a geoeconomic inversion, where first of all, your friends start to be able to kill you faster than your enemies. So if Greek and Italian banks had gone under last night, Conti might have called me and said, Tom, I'm sorry, we have to cancel your talk because Greek and Italian banks went under. And I would have said, but Conti, Greece and Italy, they're in NATO, they're in the EU. Oh, but in an interdependent world, they can kill us and Singapore at the same time. Had China taken 6 more islands in the South China Sea last night, I would have lost no sleep whatsoever. Had China lost 6% growth last night, I would not have slept last night, and neither would any of you. China falling in an interdependent world is much more dangerous to us than China rising. That is a climate change. And lastly, we're going through a change in the climate of technology and business. I'm a big believer that whatever can be done will be done. That's why I always study what's going on in technology very closely. Whatever can be done will be done. The only question is, will it be done by you or to you, by a bad guy or a competitor? And they're both always early adopters. So I'm always asking what can be done. And what can be done today is every business can now sensorize, capture all the data around its business. It can analyze that data and find the needle in the haystack of its data as the norm, not the exception. It can then optimize off that data. Jets flying can now optimize the exact altitude. It can prophesize off that data. You may have seen the ad for the IBM Watson cognitive computer. IBM Watson repairman comes to a high-rise building, tells the doorman, I'm here to fix the elevator. Doorman says, excuse me, the elevator's not broken. And the IBM Watson repairman says, I know, but it will be in 6 weeks and 3 days. You can prophesize off that data now. You can customize off that data just for guys from Minnesota with brown eyes and a mustache. You can localize off that data just for the area around NUS, and you can digitize and automatize new jobs, products, and services off that data. You put all that together, and every business today is going through a climate change. And about 20% of them have gone through it. We're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. So what do you want when the climate changes? You want 2 things. First of all, you want resilience. You need to be able to take a blow because stuff happens when the climate changes. But the second thing you want is propulsion. You want to be moving ahead at the same time. You don't want me saying, Kishore, come out from under the table, the climate change is over. So to me, the central question of politics today is how you get resilience and propulsion when every country and company is going through 3 climate changes all at the same time. That, to me, is the central question of politics today. So as I thought about that, I thought, well, who do I go to for advice on how you get resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? And then I realized I knew this woman. She was 3.8 billion years old. She dealt with more climate changes than anybody. Her name was Mother Nature. So I called her up, made an appointment, went out to see her. I said, Mother Nature, how do you produce resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? She said, well, Tom, I have to tell you, everything I do unconsciously. But these are my strategies. She said, first, I'm incredibly adaptive. In my world, it's not the smartest that survive. It's not the strongest that survive. It's actually the most adaptive that survive. And I teach that lesson through a process I call natural selection. You may have heard of it. Secondly, she said, I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Wherever I see a blank space in nature, I fill it with a plant or animal perfectly adapted to that niche. I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Third, she said, I'm incredibly pluralistic. Oh, Tom, she said, I'm the most pluralistic, diverse person you've ever met. I try 20 different species of everything. I see who wins. And she told me something interesting. She told me she noticed that her most diverse ecosystems are often her most resilient and propulsive ecosystems. Oh, Tom, she said, I love diversity. Fourth, she said, I'm incredibly hybrid and heterodox in my thinking. Nothing dogmatic about me. I'll try any trees with any soils, any bees with any flowers. I'm incredibly practical, pragmatic in my thinking. Fifth, she said, I'm completely open source. I let anybody fork off anywhere they want where they can find energy and opportunity. Six, she said, my healthiest ecosystems, I noticed, Tom, they actually all network together into complex adaptive networks where the networking maximizes their resilience and propulsion. Seventh or eighth, I've lost track, she said, I'm a lifelong learner, and I turn all my new learning into DNA. And last, she did say, Tom, I do believe in the laws of bankruptcy. I kill all my failures. I return them to the great manufacturer in the sky, and I take their energy to nourish my successes. So my argument, actually, is that the university, the company, the country, the city-state that most closely mirrors Mother Nature's strategies for building resilience and propulsion when the climate changes is the one that will thrive in this age of acceleration. That's my core argument. Well, let me show you how that plays out in different arenas. Let's first look at business and technology. Which are the strategies and which are the companies that are thriving most, I would argue, in business and technology today? Well, they're the ones who are, first of all, going through that process of sensorizing, analyzing, optimizing, prophesizing, customizing, digitizing, and automatizing. But secondly, they're the ones who have introduced lifelong learning into basically their companies and how they relate to their workers. So I'll give you the example of AT&T. So one of the ways I learn, I'm actually technically the foreign affairs columnist at the New York Times. But I spend a huge amount of time with big businesses. And the reason I do that is that I like to visit people who are living close to the sun, okay, in their business. So I'll go to, say, in my book, I profiled AT&T, our big telecom. And I come to your business and I say, I'm not interested in your stock price, not interested in who your next CEO is, not interested in your quarterly earnings. I just want to visit your HR department. Because there's a pretty good chance, if you're AT&T and you're competing in the most intense, one of the most intense businesses in the world, global telecom. You're fighting every day with Deutsche Telekom and British Telecom and Sprint and Verizon. You're living right next to the sun. There's a pretty good chance that whatever is happening in the HR department at AT&T is coming to a Singapore near you, okay? So what's actually going on in HR at AT&T? For them to get resilience and propulsion out of their workforce. What's going on is they have about 300,000 employees, but they have 110,000 managers. And now they've got all their managers on their own in-house LinkedIn system. So I'm an AT&T manager and I'm there, and they actually can see what all my education was, what jobs I've had at AT&T. And then they have another just parallel list, what are the jobs, the rising new jobs in AT&T that year, and do my skills in any way cross-link to those. Then they created an in-house online university with Udacity, which created 10, every year changes, nano degrees that line up with those skills. And then they came to me and said, Tom, you've got 7 of the 10 skills you need to be a rising employee at AT&T this year, but you're missing 3. Then they came to me and said, here's the deal. We will give you up to $8,000 a year, to take the courses for the skill sets you're missing. By the way, we heard you're interested in the Middle East. You want to take a course in archaeology? We'll pay for that as well. We're into learning around here. We've also created a $6,000 a year master's degree in computer science. You want to take that at Georgia Tech online? We're in for that as well. Just one condition, Mr. Tom. You have to take these courses at night, at home, and on weekends, and on your own time, not on company time. If I then say, you know what, Mr. AT&T, I've actually climbed up enough telephone poles. That's actually not how I want to spend my weekends. AT&T now has a wonderful severance package for me. But I will not be working at AT&T much longer. AT&T's new social contract with their employees, for their employees' resilience and AT&T's, is you can still be a lifelong employee at AT&T, but only if you're a lifelong learner. And if you're no longer ready to be a lifelong learner, you can no longer be a lifelong employee at AT&T. And that is the social contract coming to a Singapore near you. And that has huge implications. One of the implications is something one of my other teachers, Heather McGowan, likes to say, Mom, Dad, never ask your kids today what you want to be when you grow up. Because whatever it is, not going to be here unless it's policemen or firemen, okay? Only ask your kids today how you want to be when you grow up. Will you be predisposed to be a lifelong learner? Because that will be the single most important competitive advantage. Because if it isn't here already, it's coming soon, that the courses you take in the first year here at this wonderful university, many of the subject materials will be outdated by the 4th year. I profiled in my book Udacity, and Sebastian Thrun, the founder of Udacity, pointed out to me that when Google released TensorFlow, it's a machine learning algorithm, Udacity had a course up in TensorFlow within 30 days. Did NUS have a course up in TensorFlow after 30 days? So I was just out to see Sebastian a few months ago, and he told me Google just released TensorFlow 2.0, and Udacity had a course up on it the next day. In fact, they actually co-produced it with Google. So if you are not going to be predisposed to be a lifelong learner, you're going to have a real problem building resilience and propulsion in this age. And that does lead to one of the things that's freaking out every developed and developing society today. And it's something another teacher of mine, Marina Gorbis, taught me. If I were here 10 years ago, we would have been talking about the digital divide. You know, Singapore's got internet and parts of Indonesia don't. Upstate New York doesn't have internet, New York City does. The digital divide really mattered. Today, the digital divide is rapidly disappearing. In 5 years, I believe it'll be largely gone for most people on the planet. When that is, the most important divide in the world for resilience and propulsion will be the self-motivation divide. whose kids have the self-motivation to be lifelong learners, long after they've left home, and mom and dad are not there to say, Kishore, have you done your homework? Okay. So that's resilience and propulsion in the business technology realm. What about in geopolitics? So my chapter on geopolitics is called Order versus Disorder. And the reasons it's called that is that, for millennia, the world actually was governed by empires. Until really the 20th century and the 19th century, when we began to break up into individual little nation states like this one, as a result of decolonization, World War I and World War II. So much so that we woke up in 1945 and discovered we had 192 countries in the United Nations. We've never had that many individual nation states. 50 years after World War II were a great time to be a weak little state. Oh, if you were a weak, average little state, that was your era. First, there were two superpowers throwing money at you, competing for your affection as a result of their global competition over the global chessboard, building your university, helping you with your infrastructure, building your government house, educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow or Ohio State in America. You could be Syria and lose 3 wars to Israel and get your army rebuilt for free all 3 times. It's a fantastic time to be a weak little state. Secondly, it was a great time because populations were very under control. Third, climate change was very moderate. Fourth, no one had one of these to even compare their leader to the village next door, let alone the country next door. And lastly, China was not in the World Trade Organization. So every country in the world could be in the textile business. Everyone could be in low-wage industries, including this one. So all that changes with my accelerations. All that gets blown up in the early 21st century. Now no superpower wants to touch you because all they win is a bill. That's what Donald Trump is telling us every day now. What Putin's doing in Syria is an anomaly. Basically, no one wants to touch you because all they win is a bill. Second, climate change is now hammering all of these countries. Third, populations have exploded. Iran's population, when the revolution happened in 1979, was about 40 million. Today, it's over 90 million. Now, every one of your citizens has one of these. This is actually a handheld MRI machine that people just put up, MRIs at their society, their president, their leader. And then when you flip it over, it turns into a giant broadcast device that you can tell the world everything you've seen without an editor, a libel lawyer, or a filter. And lastly, China is in the World Trade Organization, so nobody can be in the textile business. And as a result, a lot of these average countries are falling apart. And the ones that are going first are those whose borders are primarily straight lines. Beware any country whose borders are all right angles, because they are the most artificial. So you see it in my hemisphere, or in Latin America. These countries are literally fracturing and hemorrhaging their people. You see it in Middle East, North Africa, and the Sahel. These countries are fracturing and hemorrhaging people. A couple we blew up, others are blowing themselves up on their own just fine. And what this is doing is creating vast numbers of people on the move who are trying to get out of their worlds of disorder into the world of order, creating these populist nationalist backlashes in Europe and North America in the world of order. And to get resilience and propulsion now as a weak little country requires so much more diligent governance than many of them have the capacity to generate. They could take a lot of lessons from Singapore, but you got to have your thinking cap on now every day. That's what's going on in geopolitics. What about in ethics? Ethics. What's this guy talking about? Why do we need resilience and propulsion in ethics? Well, that chapter in my book is actually called, Is God in Cyberspace? Is God in Cyberspace? Best question I've ever gotten on book tour in my life. 1999, I'm in Portland, Oregon at the Portland Theater, selling a book, Lexus and the Olive Tree, and a young man stands up at question time, says, Mr. Friedman, I have a question. I have a question. Is God in cyberspace? I said, I have no idea. Felt like a complete idiot. So I went home, I called my spiritual teacher. He's a rabbi I got to know when I was the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem. Brilliant Talmudic scholar named Tzvi Marx, now lives in Amsterdam, married to a Dutch priest, interesting character. I tracked Tzvi down in Amsterdam. I said, Tzvi, I got a question I've never had before. Is God in cyberspace? What should I have said? He said, well, Tom, in our faith tradition, we actually have two concepts of the Almighty. We have a biblical concept and a post-biblical concept. The biblical concept says the Almighty is almighty. He smites evil and rewards good. And if that's your view of God, he sure isn't in cyberspace, which is full of pornography, gambling, cheating, lying, prevarication, people smearing one another on Twitter, and now we know fake news. But fortunately, he said, we have a post-biblical view of God. And the post-biblical view of God says God manifests himself by how we behave. So if we want God to be in cyberspace, we actually have to bring him there by how we behave there. That's the only way we're going to have a resilient cyberspace. I really liked his answer. I put it into the 2000 paperback edition of Lexis Neolatry, where none of you saw it, and it sat there for 16 years. I sat down to write this book, and I found myself spontaneously retelling that story. And I sat myself down finally one day and said, why are you retelling that story? And it quickly became apparent to me, and it was for two reasons, and one just happened. The first reason was because sometime in the last couple of years, we, in the developed world, and increasingly in the developing world, began to live 51% of our lives in cyberspace. Yeah, that's not where you go to find a date, find a spouse, call a cab, buy a book, write a book, do your banking, do your brokerage, buy a house, buy a car, get your news, generate your news. You're now living 51% of your life in cyberspace and growing. And what's my definition of cyberspace? It's a realm where we're all connected and no one's in charge. It's a realm where we're all connected, but no one's in charge. There's no police in cyberspace. No stoplights, no stop signs, no courts, no 1-800, please stop Vladimir Putin from hacking my election, okay? But that's not where you're living more than half your life. In other words, you're living more than half your life in a realm that is fundamentally God-free. And at the same time, because of these three accelerations, we as a species are now standing at a moral intersection we've never stood at before. In 1945, post-Hiroshima, we entered a world where one country could kill all of us. If it had to be one country, I'd prefer it be the United States, frankly. I think we're entering a world now where one person can kill all of us because of these accelerations, and at the same time, where all of us could actually fix everything. We have never been here before as a species where one of us could kill all of us. And all of us, if we now put our minds to it, we actually have the tools to feed, house, clothe, and educate every person on the planet. We have never been here before. And what is this place? It means we've never been more godlike as a species than we are today. We have never had the power that one of us could kill all of us and all of us could fix everything. Well, put those two together. You've never lived more of your life in a realm that's God-free, and we have never been more godlike. What does that mean? It means that what every single person thinks, feels, and believes now really matters. It means that every single person needs to be in the grip of sustainable values. At their most basic, the golden rule, and every faith and culture has their version of it: do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. Because you now live in a world where more people can do unto you here in Singapore from farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. And you can do unto others farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. Putin did unto us in our election. Everyone needs to be in the grip of sustainable values, and at a minimum, the golden rule, if we want to have resilience and propulsion in this world today. I know what you're thinking. I gave part of this part of my talk as the graduation address at Olin College of Engineering a couple years ago. And I said to the parents there, I know what you're thinking. You paid $200,000 so your kid could get an engineering degree. And who do they bring in as the commencement speaker? but a knucklehead promoting the golden rule. Is there anything more naive? And what I told them is what I will tell you. In the age of acceleration, where men, women, and machines get this super empowered and interdependent, naivete is going to be the new realism. Because I'll tell you what's really naive. Thinking we're going to be okay. When men, women, machines get this super empowered and interdependent, if everyone is not in the grip of sustainable values and the golden rule. Where do sustainable values come from? Two places, I believe: strong families and healthy communities. Not an expert on strong families, hope I built one, but would never be so arrogant as to lecture you about that subject. I am an expert, though, on healthy communities because I grew up in one in Minnesota, a small town there. And that brings me sort of to the concluding area I want to talk about, which is how do we get resilience and propulsion in politics and community, because the two are related. So let's talk about politics. You may have noticed, if you've been reading the papers, that every political party in the industrial world has blown up in the last 5 years. The British Labour Party has blown up. They're now a Marxist party. The Tories have blown up. I don't know what they are. The Republican Party used to be a free trade deficit hawk party. It's now a protectionist, spend all the money you want party with a cult of personality in Donald Trump. The Democrats have completely blown up. They just don't know it yet because they're not in power. The French parties have completely blown up. Macron is the only leader in the world, actually, who's a president who has no party, and he's got an opposition that has no leader, okay? Spain's political parties have blown up. Italy, I don't know who governs Italy. Does anyone here know? So you may have noticed that every major political party in the industrial world has blown up in the last 5 years. And the reason that is the case is because of my 3 climate changes. You see, all these parties in the industrial world were built around a very stable set of binary choices for 50, 60 years. Those choices were capital versus labor. Big government, high regulation; small government, low regulation. Open to immigration, closed to immigration. Open to free trade, closed to free trade. Social norms to be embraced: gay marriage, transgender rights; social norms to be banned; and finally, green versus growth. And these parties all across the industrial world just lined up with one side of that or the other. Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Labor versus Tories, Democrats for Republicans. And the lists were very stable. And the parties were very stable for 50, 60 years until my climate changes hit. And now what's happened is they've been completely blown apart by these climate changes. So I'll just give you one small example. Say I'm a steel worker in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm in the steel union. Monday to Friday, oh baby, I'm with labor. Labor, Bernie. I'm feeling the burn Monday to Friday, okay? I am so with labor. But on Saturday, to pick up some spare change, I drive for Uber. And on Sunday, I rent out my kid's spare bedroom on Airbnb to pick up a little extra cash. And what I can't find, and then in my free time, I go shopping at Walmart for the cheapest made Chinese goods, and what I can't find there, I buy on Amazon.com. Oh, on weekends, baby, I'm with capital. Low regulation, capital, Donald. Which party am I in? Well, Monday to Friday, I'm with labor. Saturday to Sunday, I'm with capital. And that's why all these parties have blown up, because they can't manage to move to what is the new grid, which is Mother Nature's strategies for building resilience and propulsion. And basically, politics all over the industrial world is now in this transition from the old left-right set of binary choices to finding a new grid. And that's why people often accuse me, it's always done with a snarl, of being a centrist. You're a centrist, Friedman. And what I always try to explain to them is I'm actually not some mush between your right and left poles. I'm actually completely on another grid. And that's why in my book what I did was imagine what if Mother Nature had been running against Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in our last election. And I created Mother Nature's political party that actually can do this straddle and show you what the new grid looks like. Where do you see that new grid actually in place in America and around the world, in cities and towns, and in city-states. You see, the cliche about America today is that we're a country divided between two coasts that are liberalizing, pluralizing, globalizing, and diversifying, and then there's flyover America, where everyone's high on opioids, voted for Trump, and waiting for 1950 to come back, okay? That is the cliche about America. Well, I happen to be from flyover America, a small town in Minnesota, and I can tell you that ain't true. America today is actually a checkerboard of communities that are rising from the bottom up and communities that are collapsing from the bottom down. And to me, the most interesting political science investigation in America, and it's one I've been trying to do in my own way, is to understand, why does one community rise and one fall? Why does one community produce resilience and propulsion and the other produce opioids, unemployment, and suicide? That's the biggest question, I think, at the community level. So I'll just give you one example I wrote about recently, and then we'll invite Kishore up and we'll continue this. So, because I've been basically traveling to communities for the last couple of years trying to understand this. So as I said, I'm from Minnesota, and I grew up in St. Louis Park, a town outside of Minneapolis, but I actually grew up visiting a small town in west central Minnesota, 2 hours west of Minneapolis, right between Minneapolis and the Dakota border, called Willmar, Minnesota. And I grew up visiting there because my aunt and uncle, my dad's sister and brother-in-law, moved to Willmar in 1949 after the war to start a little steel company. At the time they moved, Willmar was 99.9% white, Protestant, Lutheran, German, and Scandinavian, and 3 Jewish families, one of whom was my aunt and uncle. We, the Jews of Minnesota, called ourselves the Frozen Chosen, and they moved out there to Willmar, Minnesota. So I actually spent 50 years visiting Willmar. Anyways, sometime around, I don't know, late 1970s, I never forgot, my aunt came down to Minneapolis for a family event, and she pulled me aside and she said, Tom, I was in the grocery store today, and I heard someone speaking Spanish. I heard someone speaking Spanish. She thought that was Martian. And I never forgot it because of the way she delivered that news to me. Well, my aunt and uncle died about 10 years ago, passed away, and I stopped going to Willmar. But 6 months ago, a woman running an NGO, Dana Mortensen, that worked in Willmar, came to visit me in Minneapolis and in Washington. And she told me they were working there, and I said, I've been working on small towns. I always wanted to know what's going on in Willmar. And she said, well, we're working there. I said, well, I'll do you a trade. I'll give you a free lecture, and you set up a day tour of me for Willmar. So she did that. So about 4 months ago, I went out to Willmar, and we drove up there, and our first stop was Willmar High School. And you come in the lobby there, and there's now a big steel global map on the wall there, and the principal explained to us that at the beginning of every school year, the students come out with a ladder, and they put pins now in all the different countries that Willmar High students are from. Because Willmar, Minnesota today is almost 50% Somali and Latino. A town that 40 years ago was virtually entirely white, Protestant, Scandinavian, and German. It is nearly 50% Somali and Latino. And how are they managing their diversity? Quite well. So Willmar is an example of a community that has risen from the bottom up. What are the strategies that they employed? And you find this across all these rising communities. Well, first of all, they faced a sense of urgency. In some communities, it's because the factory left. In some, it's a different set of problems. In Willmar, the urgency was the fact that Willmar had zero unemployment. Zero unemployment. If you could fog up a mirror, you could get a job in Willmar today, okay? As an ag scientist or at the Genio turkey factory. I mean, they need employment, okay? Well, when that happens, when you have that urgency, Every employer says, don't care what color you are, what language you speak, what God you pray to. All I care is your soft skills. Will you wake up, dress up, clean up, sit up, show up, learn up, and shut up? And if you will do that, you have a job in Wilmer, Minnesota today. Okay. So what that did, that urgency, burst through all of the natural resistance, residual racism, fear and fright of the other, number one. Second, Wilmer has a high density, as do all these rising communities, of leaders without authority. Leaders without authority. They're people who grew up in the community who just say, not going to happen here. My town is not going to fail. My granddaddy lived here, my daddy lived here, my mama came from here, I want my kids to live here. Town is not going to fail. So in Wilmer, the first Ramadan, the Somalis had nowhere to pray because there was, of course, no mosque there. And the fire chief gave them the fire station. A lot of people in the community weren't happy about that. Somebody threw a pig's foot at a Somali woman. Fire chief said, too bad. They're going to use the fire station. Leader without authority. Third thing they have is these leaders without authority all network together into what? Complex adaptive coalitions. Remember Mother Nature? Complex adaptive networks. They create complex adaptive coalitions where the business community partners with the education community, partners with the philanthropic community, partners with the social entrepreneur community, partners with the city government, and they create a coalition to manage the climate change, to get the most out of it, and to cushion the worst. And the first rule of these coalitions, I profiled Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They meet every Friday morning at 7 a.m. at Art Mann's kitchen table. And they explained to me the first rule of their coalition is, you see that hook on the door? Before you came in the room, hang your politics on that hook. Because our politics is called what works. Utterly hybrid and heterodox, again, just like Mother Nature. Then what happens in all these communities is they make huge investments in public wealth. Baseball fields, community centers, bandstands. They invest in their public wealth to reinforce the complex adaptive coalition. In Wilmer's case, the biggest health provider in the state of Minnesota, Blue Cross Blue Shield, came to Wilmer and they organized a set of community dinners. They got leaders in the community to host 10, 12 people at home in dinner. Each dinner discussed what they thought the community needed. Then the whole community came together. They chose a dozen of them. And Blue Cross Blue Shield, the health insurance company, spent $250,000 2 years in a row to fund these community projects. There were things from elder care and infant kindergartens together to how to help Somali women identify autism in their young kids. I asked the people at Blue Cross Blue Shield, why did you do that? They said, it's very simple, Tom. We discovered that people who live in healthy communities are also healthier. And so for us, it was a great investment. So that's basically how healthy communities are building resilience and propulsion when the climate changes. I wish it was true all over America. It's not. Not easy to build those kinds of coalitions. But that's really what's going on today. From countries to companies to communities to business, facing this challenge of how to build resilience and propulsion when the climate changes. And because I think the community level is something every country is going through. I ended my book with that story and also my theme song. My book has a theme song and my talk ends with it as well. I actually explored whether I could buy this song, so when you open my book, it would play this song like a Hallmark card that plays Happy Birthday. And I should have prepared you, because sometimes when I give this talk, they actually play. It's by one of my favorite singers named Brandi Carlile. Some of you may be familiar with her. Great country folk singer. And she's got a song, it's called The I, E-Y-E, that I believe is the anthem of our time. The main refrain is, I wrapped your love around me like a chain, but I never was afraid that it would die. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. Oh, you can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. You see, friends, my accelerations, they're a hurricane, and everybody's getting hit by it. There are countries around the world who are electing leaders to build walls against the hurricane. And there are others who are opting to strengthen the I. The I is the healthy community, a place where people can feel connected, protected, and respected. An I that moves with the storm, draws energy from it, but creates dynamic stability, like riding a bike, not stability that you think you can get from a wall and holding in place. And I think the great struggle in world politics going forward is actually going to be between the wall people and the I people. And my book is a manifesto for the I people. Thank you very much.
As usual, fascinating. And I hope that you've all have lots of questions ready, and you can either submit them later on this program, or you can stand up and ask a question. But in the meantime, while you're thinking, Tom and I agreed that we would have a dialogue first. And Tom, maybe just to give you some rest.
Please, go for it a little bit. I could use
so
a little.
your throat can recover.
Thank you.
I'll say a few remarks, because what I'm going to build on is your point about if China's GNP went down 6%, that's what makes you lose sleep. And in a sense, that's what's actually puzzling a lot of us here in this region. If China's success is so important, and especially important for this region, why has the United States decided to launch a kind of assault on China? Why has it decided to launch a geopolitical contest against China at this stage? And in my view, I actually think that the United States is making a strategic mistake in going after China now and going after China in the way that it is. And I'll sort of briefly explain why it's a strategic mistake. And then hopefully we would try and have a dialogue. And one thing that Tom and I discussed also earlier today is that in our world today, it's actually very difficult to get a civilized disagreement. So we're going to try and see whether we can have an example of civilized disagreement, because the world is in many areas, as you said, is getting more and more polarized, and we've got to create, in a sense, reverse the clock backwards in some areas, and even in universities, and try and figure out how you can have a civilized disagreement, because people have very, very different points of view. So let me, on the US-China issue, which is actually gaining a lot of momentum in the US, I would say the US has actually made three strategic mistakes in launching this geopolitical contest. The first is that it launched this contest without working a comprehensive long-term strategic plan. And the person who gave me this insight actually was Henry Kissinger at a lunch I had with him in New York. And it's in some ways a bit weird, because China is not just any other country. You know, China's been around for 2,200 years. It's handled lots of ups and downs, and I think since you use a key word, resilience, if there's one word that would describe the Chinese civilization, it's resilience. Is the only civilization actually that has, as Wang Gangwu says, has fallen down 4 times and then stood up 4 times. So they have a 2,000 years record of resilience. And just as they're about to enter one of the most beautiful phases, the United States comes along and says, hey, we're going to knock you down. And so that, I think, in terms of approach, is a strategic mistake. Because if you look at how the Chinese are playing this game and the Americans are playing the game, my sense is that the Chinese are running a marathon and the Trump administration is running a sprint, trying to see what's the biggest deal, sweet deal you can get on the trade talks without thinking about the long-term game that is also at play down there. So that's one strategic mistake. The other is to sort of, in some ways, the second strategic mistake is to bring in all the old conceptual structure of the Cold War and then apply it to the US-China contest. So, for example, if you look at the speeches that Mike Pence gives, Pompeo gives, they emphasize that Chinese still has a communist party system. And of course, if this was a straight-out contest between a vibrant American democracy and a sclerotic Soviet-style communist party system, the vibrant democracy would win. But something has happened that's transformed these two societies. United States has become, in some ways, a bit of a plutocracy, where the rich have essentially taken over the decision-making in America. And as a result of this, and Professor Denny Kwa has documented this, United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over the 30-year period. By contrast, in the case of China, the bottom 50% have enjoyed the best 30 years in 3,000 years ever. So, so China functionally is the exact opposite of the Soviet Union. It's not a sclerotic communist party, it's actually a meritocracy. So if you have a contest within a meritocracy and a plutocracy, it's possible for a meritocracy to defeat a plutocracy. So that's the second strategic mistake. And the third one is that if you look at the rest of the world, while there was some enthusiasm at the beginning of the Cold War for the United States in defending freedom against this despotic empire, if you look around the world today, there's very little enthusiasm around the world to see this geopolitical contest. It's really, everybody in some ways actually quite aggravated with it for two reasons. One is, you said something very important. You said one of the remarkable things about our time is that for the first time in human history, we can feed, clothe, house every human being. Now that's an amazing achievement when you consider how most of humanity has lived through absolute poverty for most of human history. So now we're actually getting rid of absolute poverty, and many, many countries are progressing in that direction. So they feel they're going in the right direction. The last thing they want is the disruption caused by the US-China geopolitical contest. And the second thing is actually your key point about the impact of climate change in our lives. I think there's a new global consensus developing that that's the real priority. We should all focus on climate change, and more countries want to focus on climate change and not on this geopolitical contest, which is a distraction. And as I said to you at lunch today, I conclude my book, my next book, by saying that if future historians watching this US-China geopolitical contest at a time of rising climate change would say, this is very strange. This looks like two tribes of apes fighting each other while the forest is burning, right? So it doesn't make sense. Why are you guys fighting when there's a far larger, important dynamic that we have to deal with? And in some ways, your message about climate change, therefore, becomes much more important, because I think that's the big lever I think we can use to try and contain or constrain this US-China geopolitical contest from getting out of hand. But so I thought I'd say something like that. Then
Great.
we could
That's a good tee-up.
exchange some views.
So I'm going to respectfully push back, Kishore, on that. Because those who read my column know I vaguely supported Trump on the China trade issue, which is not a natural thing for me. My view is that Donald Trump is not the American president America deserves, but he is the American president China deserves. And so let me explain why. I believe China grew from poverty to middle income over the last 30 years remarkably, something good for China and good for the world in aggregate, by using a kind of three silo strategy. The first silo, the most important in my view, was hard work, delayed gratification, kind of national pulling together, smart investments in infrastructure, and smart investments in education. Silo number one. And my hat is off to that. Silo number two was stealing other people's intellectual property, forced technology transfer, non-compliance with WTO rules, and the like. Silo number three was the U.S. Pacific Fleet. China should have been paying for the U.S. Pacific Fleet because it was the presence of the U.S. Pacific Fleet which allowed China to economically dominate all its neighbors without them worrying that they would be geopolitically dominated. And that really allowed China to extend its influence. So that's the context, in my view, how China grew. It didn't just grow by hard work. And so my view is now China used that strategy to get rich, basically making toys, t-shirts, and tennis shoes, solar panels, and the like. Now they rightly and understandably and capably want to get rich on a different strategy. Microchips, artificial intelligence, supercomputers, software, all the 21st century, 2025 industries that Xi Jinping has identified. If we, America, and we, the world, let China use that same three-silo strategy that it used to get from poverty to middle income, to get from middle income to high income, we would be out of our minds, in my view. And that's why Donald Trump did not come from outer space on this issue. He is acting, I think, on a very rational interest. Where I disagree with Trump is the strategy that he used. That had I been designing the strategy, I would have, number one, signed the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement and brought 40% of global GDP together around 21st century trade and trading values that were very much written, made in America, number one. Number two, I would have gone to the Europeans and said, you guys have the same problem we have with China. Come join us as well. Then I would have called Xi Jinping and said, you send your 4 top trade negotiators to Hainan Island. I'm going to send my 4. I'm going to have 70% of global GDP on my side, my European brothers and sisters, and my Pacific economy brothers and sisters. And we're going to do all this in private. Nobody's going to lose face. Everyone's going to be a winner. But in private, I'm going to nail you so bad you're not going to know what hit you. But we're going to come out and say, everybody was a winner. What did Trump do instead? He tore up TPP without reading it. Yeah. He put steel and aluminum tariffs on the Europeans, completely alienated them, and then said to Xi, let's you and I get into a trade war over who's got the biggest tariff, okay? And made it entirely a personal thing between the two of them. We had a chance to make this the world versus China on what are the right trade norms, standards, and rules for the 21st century. Had we done that, we would have mobilized every reformer inside China because they would have been rooting for us, as they did on WTO. Instead, by making it Trump versus Xi, we forced every reformer inside to wave the nationalist flag. Now, this strategy seems to be the Trump specialty because Trump has basically decided, I'm going to challenge the two of the oldest civilizations on the planet at once, China and Persia, okay? And I'm going to use the same strategy with both. I'm going to use oil sanctions on Persia and trade sanctions on China. But because he never builds it around international norm, standards, and values, in both cases, he forced our allies inside these countries who are rooting for these global standards to be imposed to actually have to wave the nationalist flag. And that's why both strategies have failed. And that's sort of how I see it.
But you said something very important. You said that Trump is the president that China deserves.
Yeah.
So the interesting question, therefore, is with the elections coming up in 2020, would China like to see Trump re-elected or defeated?
Very good question, Kishore. My view is both China and Russia will be voting Trump in 2020. And
Why?
For a very simple reason. Because as long as Trump is president, he will keep America in turmoil and he will be incapable of building any alliance against either party. He is incapable of galvanizing a Pacific alliance and he's incapable of galvanizing a Euro-Atlantic alliance. And he will keep America in turmoil. I have absolutely no doubt they will both be voting Trump in 2020.
Yeah, and I must say I agree with you.
Because
I mean, actually in some ways, it sort of confirms the point I was trying to make earlier about the Chinese thinking very long term and vis-a-vis short term. Because in the long term, I mean, right now, if you look at let's say the trade negotiators in the United States, especially the Trump team, they're trying to see whether China will buy 20 billion or 30 billion or 50 billion of soya beans, And those are what I call the bean counters.
Yeah.
And for the Chinese, it's 20, 30, 50, doesn't matter. What matters at the end of the day is how will China benefit or lose if there's 4 more years of Trump.
Yeah.
And clearly 4 more years of Trump will be very good for China because it will expand the geopolitical space for China. And the global consensus, therefore, will be more balanced,
So let me
towards U.S. and China.
Let me push back on that a little bit because this is not just about Trump, it's also about Xi Jinping. And I would argue he's played his hand also very poorly. So I've been going to China for at least 30 some years now, and China today is so much more open than it was 30 years ago, and so much more closed than it was 5 years ago. And that is about Xi Jinping and his domestic strategy. And I get some of it, the need to fight corruption and all of that. But China is a much more closed system today, and I believe one of the things that set Hong Kong off was a lot of young Hong Kongers thought that China was on this trajectory to become more like Hong Kong. And it is now sunk in that it is not on that trajectory. And you have a lot of young people saying in Hong Kong, you can take that social credit score thing and you can shove it, because we do not want that here. We have our own identity. And so I think Xi's overreach in the South China Sea, around these islands, has freaked out all of his neighbors. Pence's speech, and I'm against where these guys are going, didn't come out of nowhere though. You know, it came out of a very aggressive action in the South China Sea and telling America and the world by 2025 we're going to own these industries. Well, you're going to catalyze a reaction from that. So I think Xi's overplayed his hand. He has not played it well. And so Trump and Pence didn't come out of nowhere. And that's what I've tried to say. You know, as someone who really believes in the U.S.-China relationship, and it's essential that it be stable and mutually productive. It's been, I think, one of the great engines of growth and peace in the world. The relationship that we've had between the U.S. and China for the last 30 years has been good for the whole world and good for both our countries. But I think people didn't notice, Kishore, that just a couple weeks ago, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think it's coinciding with what will be known as the first anniversary of the rise of the digital Berlin Wall between the US and China. And the only question that remains to be resolved now is how high will this wall be? And that pains me. And as I've said to my Chinese friends and people in government there, Donald Trump's not your problem. Pence isn't your problem. I'm your problem. People like me who really believe in the centrality of this relationship. But you gotta meet us halfway. Just one time, I would like to see China say, you know what, we're going to do this because it'd be good for the world. Okay, and not look at the negotiations we're having over soybeans and Boeings. You know, I mean, yeah, it would be the easiest thing for them to say to Trump, you know what, Mr. Trump, this bud's for you. Okay, we're gonna. What do we want? We want them to have proper intellectual property laws, which young Chinese innovators need. You know what I mean? So the idea that we have to wrestle them down and squeeze this out of them with so much venom that when you're done, you're just so disgusted with the whole thing. That I just don't think that's smart, and it puts people like me who really do believe in the relationship and defenders of it, and people like Henry Kissinger. You know, the ballast in this relationship was always the business community and the geopolitical writers like myself who understood the centrality of it. And China has managed to alienate all of us. It has no the business community, Hank Paulson, these are the people who are now giving speeches saying, hey, you guys, you overreached. And so I am second to none in my criticism of Trump, but I'm also second to none in my criticism of Xi Jinping on this. I think they both overplayed their hands.
Okay, I completely agree with you that one of the biggest strategic mistakes that China has made has been to alienate the American business community. That was completely unnecessary, huge mistake, and as a result, when Trump launches trade war against China, traditionally the American business community would apply their foot on the brakes, and they didn't. They just said, carry on. But at the same time, on Xi Jinping, the interesting question to ask, a very easy question to ask is, what do the 1.4 billion people think of Xi Jinping? That, and of course, you don't really have proper elections and opinion polls and so on and so forth. But even, you know, very independent observers, you know, have you heard of the Edelman Trust Barometer? I mean, hopefully they are fairly objective in their methods and so on and so forth. When those people do polls in China, and China actually comes, I think, in the Edelman Trust Barometer, #1 in the world in terms of trust in governance. And also, whenever a few other polls have been done indicating whether or not Xi is popular or unpopular in China, he wins the popularity polls. And it is true, by the way, that there is an elite in China, especially the university professors, some of the private sector people who actually enjoyed a certain taste of freedom after Deng Xiaoping, you know. And these are the ones that feel that Xi Jinping is closing windows that Deng Xiaoping opened for them and so forth. Remember Deng Xiaoping's famous statement, you open a window, the flies will come in, but that's okay, you know, that's what you need to do. Xi, as you're right, is closing some of these windows. But at the same time, paradoxically, the biggest force that is now keeping Xi Jinping in power in a real way is the perception that America is out to get China. And so a lot of Chinese, even those who are uncomfortable with Xi, are saying, thank God we have a strong leader like Xi Jinping who can stand up, rather than his predecessor, for example, as you know, was not as dynamic and so on and so forth. So within the Chinese body politic, if you look in terms of how legitimate or how acceptable Xi's authority is, he's actually now at an all-time high.
So I would push back on a couple things, Kishore. One is polling in an authoritarian country, it to me is just very suspect. Number two, one reason that so many Chinese feel America's out to get them is because the state media pounds that message home every place and way they can. So yes, we have our hardliners in America. We have our Cold Warriors. China has its Cold Warriors too, you know. They have a defense establishment that has an interest in America being the enemy so they can increase their budgets. By the way, we have the same kind at our Pentagon. You know what I mean? They want someone to replace China. So I would stay away from the popularity because these are very much generated. They have their own Fox TV that's doing this. And I would also say, you know, we've got in Xinjiang, I mean, there is a horror show going on out there by any standard, so horrific that a senior Chinese official leaked to the New York Times 400 pages of the most intimate internal deliberations in the party. That was a direct missile into Xi Jinping's wheelhouse. So I don't think there's this uniformity kind of that he's on the right track. And that also is a kind of poll, because when stuff like that gets leaked to us, that's really a sign. I would add a third thing, because Kishore and I were there together a couple of years ago at a very interesting dialogue at Tsinghua with Carl Bernstein and Niall Ferguson and Chinese interlocutors and Martin Wolf. And it was a wonderful dialogue. But I don't know if you remember, Kishore, at one of the opening sessions, because I actually quoted him in my story, a senior Chinese official who was there from the foreign ministry, I began with my views on trade, you know, and his pushback was, excuse me, Mr. Friedman, you're too late, we're too big. I said, excuse me, we're too late, you're too big? I said, be careful, that's not humble, okay? That's not humble. And to think that that isn't there, you know, also underneath. So my view, Kishore, is very simple. There's a lot of rattling of cages going on in both countries. The fact is, we are going to have, as you said, and this is my argument when I'm arguing with Americans, China is not the Soviet Union. All we bought from the Soviets was vodka, caviar, and nesting dolls, okay? That was all we bought from them, all right? We are in a totally interdependent relationship with China, one that has been mutually beneficial for us and for the world. And our relationship exists in multiple states at the same time. We are competitors, we are mutual suppliers, we are sources of research and intellectual vigor for each other. The cost of the mortgage of my house is impacted by China's buying our treasury bills. We are rivals, and in some cases we're enemies. And so the fact is our relationship exists in multiple states at the same time. And I think that if you and I were in charge of this relationship, what we'd be trying to navigate is actually how you do this at the same time. Because it's very very unusual in world history.
Yeah.
That's why I don't buy any of these Thucydides trap things.
Yeah.
You know, there has never been this kind of relationship with a rising power and a the incumbent power. And I think that it's just going to take great sophistication. You're not going to win them all, but that's how I see it.
I agree with you. And the other thing that you and I share in common is that both you and I have met Mr. Run of Huawei recently.
Yes, exactly.
You conveyed his offer
Yeah.
in your column to say, okay, I'll open up my source code, please have a look at it, and I'm happy to sell it in America. And I actually had a coffee with Run session that was put on Bloomberg TV, I think last week. And he again, of course, he's very keen to try and reach some kind of a deal with the United States, but this is precisely the area where you said they're going to build a digital wall.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that.
I don't. I must confess. I don't know enough about this technological world to speak about it confidently. But how exactly? Okay, let's take an example. Okay, where I think China is going to spread. Okay, Chinese are clearly number one in mobile payments. And they're amazing. I mean, if you have a mobile phone in China, and I had one for 6 weeks when I was in Shanghai for my sabbatical last year, it's amazing what you can do with your mobile phone. And I think the Chinese are then now going to spread it around the world. I wouldn't be surprised if you find it in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere. Now that's one kind of what I call digital migration, Chinese digital migration. And then on the other side, of course, you have the Google, the Facebook, and so on and so forth. So there are these two different worlds, right? How do you build a digital wall within these two worlds?
So it's a good question. I'd say your remarks, Kishore, trigger a couple of things. It's amazing, what you can do around digital payments in China. I was there, just the speaker for the China Development Forum, and I was having coffee with a couple of Chinese journalists afterwards, and there were two lovely young women. I insisted on paying, and while I was fumbling to get my wallet out of my back pocket, they had already paid with their phones, and they just said, "Sorry, we're faster." But there is a reason they're faster, and one of the reasons is China, back in the early 2000s, lost the case in the WTO where Visa, MasterCard, and American Express sued China in the WTO for being barred basically from the Chinese market. They lost that case. For 16 years, China dragged its feet until Alipay, WeChat Pay, and Union Pay could dominate the market, and just now they're letting them in. So there's a lot of stories in the naked city. You know what I mean? There's a reason that they're ahead, and if you don't follow some of these things. So I do believe there are two, and you alluded to this, Kishore. There's sort of two issues with China. There's, Boeings and soybeans. Who's buying how much of the other guy's stuff, and then there's Huawei. And Huawei is the tip of a very different iceberg. So what Huawei represents is that for 30 years, basically, China sold us what I call shallow goods. Goods we wore on our back, on our feet, or on our ankles, toys, t-shirts, tennis shoes, and solar panels we put on the roof. They sold us shallow goods. We sold them deep goods because they didn't have a choice. Software, computers, microchips. What Huawei represents is that today China can make deep goods. And there's nothing deeper than 5G technology. It actually goes into your sidewalk, into your streets, into the wiring of your home, and the bot in your bedroom. And what Huawei is about is us saying to China, we don't have the shared trust framework, the shared values to buy your deep goods. And the serious conversation we have to have, because we'll sort out the beans and the Boeings. The very serious conversation we have to have is how we can allow China to sell us deep goods, and that's why I focused on Huawei. So Huawei's story is this is Huawei. Huawei got to where Huawei got first by cheating, stealing, then copying, then out-researching, and out-innovating. We should have dealt with them a long time ago, but to deal with them now is a whole different set of challenges because we have no 5G company in America. There's only 4, Samsung, Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei. And Huawei's the biggest and rising because they're able to scale on the Chinese market, drive their costs down, keep everybody else out, and then take on the world. So this whole privacy, that's why ethics is part of my talk. This whole question of privacy, I believe we should be letting Huawei in. And my view is that everybody is spying on everybody else. You know, you know, if you do Wikipedia, Wiki, look at what's the spy guy, the American who went to Snowden. If you actually Google Snowden and Huawei, what comes up is WikiLeaks. With that Snowden was in Snowden's basket of releases. That the NSA had hacked Huawei, built a back door so it could spy on Pakistan through Huawei's, you know, a 3G or 4G system.
You're joking.
Oh yeah, that's the first thing that comes up.
NSA used Huawei.
We hacked there. We hacked Huawei. Yeah. And we were looking for whether the PLA owned Huawei, and we couldn't find it. Okay. That's what actually comes up. So
in WikiLeaks.
In WikiLeaks, yeah. So we don't exactly come to this story with clean hands. You know what I mean? And so everybody's going to be spying on everybody. And if we say, you know, China has many cool tech companies, Tencent, Alibaba, etc., the ones Baidu. But when it comes to really global manufactured tech, there's really DJI that makes drones, and there's Huawei. I mean, I'm talking about a tech company that sells stuff. Huawei's phones, they're the second largest handset maker in the world. If we say to Huawei, not to mention the biggest 5G maker, if we say to Huawei, you will never eat in this town again, in America, we're saying to China, you're big, and by the way, if Singapore installs Huawei, you won't eat in this town again either. I think that's a really bad strategy. I would rather say to Huawei, we're going to let you wire Denver. If we see you cheating, then you're never going to wire another city. But if that works out, we'll do here. I just think that the more we integrate, the more we build pathways to respectability, it's a much better strategy than building walls to access.
I completely agree with you. In fact, when I did my conversation, Coffee with Ren, the other guy on the panel with me was a German professor, and his title was the father of the modern factory in Germany. So he was a real technical guy. And he is the guy who actually said that we have actually done very serious investigation of Huawei. We've gone through everything, and we think that we can install it. So I guess,
as is Great Britain.
I think that's the approach to take. But you know, but your key point you use was trust. And you say what is really missing in this U.S.-China dimension is this lack of trust. And the question, therefore, is what are the 1, 2, 3 steps we can take to start rebuilding some of that trust that's been lost?
Well, you know, first of all, we need some kind of trade deal. That would be that's the necessary thing. It's not sufficient, but it's certainly the necessary thing. And the other is really, you know, going back to look, the Paris Climate Agreement was the result of, I think it was 4 bilateral agreements between the U.S. and China. That's the only way it happened, you know. And my view is very simple. The theme of, I gave a talk for the China Development Forum in Beijing, and the theme, my talk was built around the movie The Martian. I don't know if have you seen The Martian?
I hadn't, so
he hadn't. So, you know, but it's a great movie. Matt Damon.
How many of you have seen The Martian? Raise your hands.
Thank you.
About
Kishore, you're out of it in popular culture. So
I'm out of it.
That's right. I'm teasing. The Americans land a manned space vehicle on Mars, and Matt Damon gets separated from the crew, and he gets stranded on Mars as a Martian. And the movie is about how we try to rescue him. And it turns out the only people who have a launch vehicle that can get the supplies to Matt Damon, our Martian on Mars, is China. And the world doesn't know that China has this. So if the Chinese Space Authority doesn't tell the world, then Matt Damon will starve on Mars. And the movie is that China steps up and actually volunteers their booster rocket. And at the theater I saw it at in America, because at the end the Chinese and American space authorities are together applauding, people broke out in applause at the end of the movie.
Wow.
And that movie, and it's Hollywood, unfortunately, but we need to work toward that, because there's actually no big problem that we can address in the world today, whether it's cybercrime or climate, without U.S.-Chinese collaboration. And there's no big problem we can't, I think, effectively address today with Chinese-American collaboration Just ask the Martian. And so either we find a way to get there or we don't, but what is happening today, this decoupling between the US and China, you know, one of the problems we have in America today, I say this as a commentator, is that all we talk about is Donald Trump. That's actually all we talk about now. Whether you like him or hate him, but that's all we do in America now. We are all Trump all the time. So the conversation Kishore and I are having now, which I think would be pretty important to be going on in the Congress and the State Department, this is not happening. It's happening here at NUS, you know, but it's not happening in America. And it's a real problem because we're going to wake up. The world isn't sort of sitting there waiting for us. You know, it's enormous. We're providing such enormous global entertainment right now. If we could somehow charge you all just $1 a day for the entertainment we're providing you all, we could actually wipe out the debt. Okay. We call it the Apprentice Global. And but on a serious note, the world isn't standing still, and we're going to wake up whenever this bad dream is over. And this is a bad dream. Whenever it is over, we're going to wake up and discover the world hasn't actually, while they've been, you know, popping popcorn and putting up their feet at night, during the day they've actually been busy moving forward.
By the way, you're absolutely right about one thing, that I can't remember a single serious dinner conversation that I haven't gone to recently where Trump doesn't come up.
No.
He just automatically pops up all the time. And
all we do.
He's got this amazing capacity to suck all the oxygen in the room. That shows some skill, I guess, that he's developed. Well, I'm very glad to hear that your questions are coming in. I think this may be a good time.
Great, sure, go ahead.
To make this transition. So let me give a prize to the first person who asked the question. It's there. Traditional businesses have been disrupted by tech companies, resulting in the development of the gig economy. Uber, GrabFood, but many gig workers do not have labor protections afforded to traditional workers. Do you see this as a potential problem for fault line for countries in the future?
So it's a very good question, and I'm actually, because I was just at, who asked that question?
Guest 194.
Oh, okay, good, whatever.
Who is Guest 194, by the way?
No, so I just want to say.
He's saying.
Very good, I'd just like to be able to address you. Very good question. I was just out at Lyft in San Francisco. And Lyft, which is the Uber, in America there's Uber and Lyft, they're the two big.
You don't have Grab and Gojek?
We've got our versions of them. And they're having a huge problem because the state of California has passed a law saying that if you're a Lyft driver, you're an employee and you're entitled to certain protections. It's a good thing. But you also have to punch in and punch out. Okay? And of course, they don't want to do. They want to be able to say, turn on and off their app when they feel like driving or not. And so what you see here, and I was sharing this with Kishore over lunch, another way of talking about this breakdown between these binary, political choices and where we are today is, if you think of traditional computing, a traditional computer was built on bits that were either in the state of 1 or a 0. And computing is built on cramming as many bits, transistors onto a microchip, and creating as many 1 and 0 toggles as you can. That's what gives you compute power. But everything was just a 1 or a 0. Quantum computing is built on qubits, which can exist in multiple states at the same time. And it's the difference between flipping a quarter heads and tails, it's either a head or a tail, and spinning a quarter, which can exist in multiple states then at the same time. And at multiple angles. And if you can capture that in computing, those multiple angles, photons and electrons, you can actually get 100,000 times the compute power you can get from binary computing. But the core reason you can do that is because a qubit can exist in multiple states at the same time. I believe that we're heading for a world, if you want to manage it properly, of what I call quantum politics and quantum geopolitics. That to manage the gig economy, a worker has to be in multiple states at the same time. He's got to be like an employee, he's an employer, he's self-employed, and the laws we generate have to basically now adapt to those multiple states. And we're all struggling with this because California passed this law, and now it was in the name of the Lyft drivers and the Uber drivers, and they're all upset because they're saying, well, your law gives us protections, but it was precisely the flexibility of this job, which is why I wanted it in the first place. And so we're dealing with the old binary thing. In the old binary world, you're either an employer or an employee. In the quantum world, you're an employer, you're an employee. You're in multiple states at the same time. Just as between the US and China, our relationship is multiple states at the same time. We're competitors, we're suppliers, we're rivals, we're sourcing each other. We're in multiple states at the same time. And I think one of the great transitions we have to make as analysts, as legislators, as citizens, is how to think in this quantum way as opposed to the binary way. Because the world isn't just flat. It's gotten fused. This is a very important point. Again, something my teacher, Dov Seidman, likes to say. So once we move to everything being digitized, everything could suddenly be fused. Suddenly, Amazon could be a bookseller, a source of storage, a cloud company, and in the grocery business. Because everything just gets fused. The gig economy came about because Uber could be in the food business, the transport business, the driver business. Because when you're dealing with digits and not, hard stuff, suddenly everything gets fused. And if laws, norms, and regulations aren't therefore able to handle people in multiple states at the same time, it's not going to work. And I believe we're in the transition between what I would call binary computing and quantum computing. Not only in computing, though, but in how we think about the world.
Well, I must say, you're the only person who can try to explain quantum computing in a way that I could understand.
You just heard everything I know about quantum computing.
I decided that
don't ask
out of
any follow-up question.
I see. This actually is a good follow-up question to what you just discussed, because it brings up the keyword inequality. And the question is, in the context of your idea about the 3 climate changes and the need for resilience and propulsion, how should we handle exacerbating economic inequality, and what are the elements of the new grid to combat inequality at this time in history? And going back to my point about how the bottom 50% in the United States has seen a decline in average income over 30-year period. And do I see a lady standing there in front of the mic? Okay, we'll come to you after that. Thank you very much.
Very, very quickly, my view, I'm all for raising floors, and I'm entirely against building walls. So, one way people think of eliminating inequality or easing inequality is we're going to build walls of protection. I'm against that. I am for trying to lift the floor, and for me that's through things in America like the earned income tax credit, that if you've got a job, I think we should be topping off your wages. If the minimum wage is $13, I think it should be $15. Okay, I want to do everything to make lifelong learning free and available to as many Americans as possible for their whole life. I'm for giving everyone.
By the way, like Singapore.
Yeah,
doing this.
Exactly. Yeah, to really give people all the skills, opportunities of that AT&T worker. That is, here's where the jobs are, here's where the skills you need, here's how to get them, but you're going to have to pay, and I'm going to have to pay. I'm going to pay more as the employer, but everyone should have skin in the game. Walmart has a program now where I actually flew here from Bentonville, Arkansas, because I spoke to Walmart. I flew Bentonville, Chicago, Dubai, Singapore. And Walmart has a program where
for you the world is a little red dot.
Well, whatever. It's but Walmart has a program that for $1 a day, every employee pays $1 a day, and as a result of that, Walmart will pay for your technical certificate, your 2-year community college degree, or your 4-year community college degree. But you have to contribute $1 a day.
That's a good idea. So please, can you identify yourself?
My name is Dina Koppel, and I'm an Australian but a long-term resident of Singapore. And my question had to do with geographic as well as social mobility, which you've just spoken of. But in part, your answer was just about America. And my question comes to the fact that you come from a country, as do I, and many other countries and communities like Wilma, that have benefited from the growth from geographic mobility. and have grown. And yet that seems to be, technology has made geographic mobility a driving force to some extent as people have seen opportunities, and yet it's an increasing challenge in this world. Where do we sit and how do we keep going for propulsion and lifelong learning from new experiences if we can't be geographic as well as socially mobile?
Is there, can I just ask a quick follow-up? Is there something particular going on around Australia or in this part of the world that has prompted that question, or is there just generally?
No, just generally. I mean,
Yeah.
Australia's built is 200 and plus years of
Yeah.
immigration.
Right.
The US, some more, but it was built on immigration.
Sure.
Australia still has fairly open borders,
Yes, yeah.
but it's a challenge for people to come in, and countries
Absolutely.
are becoming more and more cautious
Right.
about the mobility.
Yeah.
And Trump wants to build a wall.
Yeah, and it's a very good question. I go back to Little Wilmer, Minnesota. So it's, I work for the editorial side of the paper, and we have a kind of a wall between the news side of the paper. And ironically, I wrote my little column about Wilmer. Actually, it wasn't so little; it was about 5,000 words. And the news side happened to do a story about a town in Minnesota 40 miles down the road called St. Cloud, which was completely failing. And it's because the Somalis call it White Cloud, because the town can't manage inclusion. And so I believe we're in an age, there are more people on the move today than at any time since the Second World War. And they're on the move partly because of the movement out of the lands of disorder, trying to get into the world of order, and partly for economic. And I think this is the future. And therefore, the ability to manage inclusion, I think, is just a hugely important competitive advantage for any country. And it pains me to see America, going the direction it's been going. My position on the wall is that I'm for a very high wall around America with a very big gate. Okay, that is, if you don't reassure your citizens that you can control your border, then you haven't fulfilled the basic element of sovereignty. But if all you do is that, then you cannot thrive as a country. And unfortunately, we got a little out of balance because this movement of people, like so many other things, happened faster than people could adapt to. See, what really happened in America over the last, and I think in Europe as well, maybe in Australia, I don't know, is somewhere in the last 10 years, a lot of Americans woke up and went to the grocery store, and the woman at the cash register wasn't wearing a baseball hat. Then they went into the men's room, and there was a woman there, and she seemed to have a penis. Then they went to the office, and their boss had just rolled a robot next to their desk, and it seemed to be studying their job. And it all happened at the same time. My sense of home, my sense of social norms, and my sense of work all got completely disrupted. And that's why so many people suddenly reach for a strong man to stop the wind, because it all happened too fast. And so you see these communities that find a way to manage those climate changes. They're doing well. They're as inclusive as ever, because they understand both the richness of the community and literally the richness of the community will depend on their ability to master inclusion. But it's hard. It takes leadership. And it happened really fast. Right now, we just went from having a president who embodied it, Barack Hussein Obama, to a president, and there was not an accident. We went from one extreme to the other, and hopefully the next president will be one who will be respectful of people's sense of being overwhelmed. In my book, I actually quote a study about Brexit that said, Brexit actually was a largely urban people voted Remain, rural people, except in rural communities where people said they felt anchored in their community. They all voted Remain. So I think that's why I go back to this sense of community, and that's sort of my reaction. So thank you.
Okay. Is there any other question from the floor? If not, let me just read one out from here. It's a slightly different area, but
Please.
It's an important area. I think that's going to be where the next big struggle is going to become. With China digitizing the yuan, do you see the China renminbi becoming the next reserve currency?
Kishore, I don't know enough about that question to give an intelligent answer. I'm sorry. I just not. That's stumped the man.
That's a bit too much honesty. In a school, you never say, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's just...
But actually, you're right. That's
out of my skill
I don't know how to
set.
answer the question.
Very good question, but it's out of my skill set.
Okay, I see none from the floor.
We have a
but
question.
there's some, by the way.
Wait, Kishore,
you want a rude question? Sorry,
question,
okay, there's a rude question here, but never mind. Go ahead.
That's okay. I'm for a rude question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk today
Can you
and
introduce
for
yourself,
yesterday as well. I'm Anlin and I'm from Singapore. My question is on your point on how do we build trust. I think across all the speakers yesterday and today, the one thing I find in common is the idea that we are lacking a common value system and we're lacking a way to talk or discuss about that particular value system and how it should manifest. I think just now Professor Kishore talked about, asked you about how China and US could build trust, and you mentioned about the need for a trade deal and the Paris Agreement. My question is, along that line, but on a principle level, how do we build trust in communities and in cultures where it has been disrupted by technology? What are the principles that underlie this rebuilding of trust, in your opinion? Thank you.
It's a very, very good question. You know, again, my teacher, Dov Seidman, likes to say that trust is the only legal performance-enhancing drug. So where there's trust in the room, you can go really fast. And when there's no trust in the room, you can't go 5 miles an hour. I think the most important way to build, I can only give your question a personal answer. How do I do it as a journalist? I don't think it's sort of magic. So young people often come to me today and say, I want to do what you do. What do I need to know? You know, and I say, well, you need to be able to type fast. I can type really fast. I actually went to night secretarial school in London to learn how to type fast. But I think there's two things you need to know, I think, to be a successful journalist. One is you have to like people, because when you like people, they tend to like you back. And what I mean is they may not like everything about you at all. They may not like a lot of things about you. But when people feel comfortable with you, they actually will open up and they'll share with you their hopes, their dreams, their crazy aspirations, and their crazy fears. And as a journalist, if you can't hear the music, you can never play the music. Unfortunately, there's a lot of journalists who I think don't like people, but that's another question. But the second thing is you have to be a good listener. So, you know, I'm a little Jewish guy from Minnesota, and I'm I'll say one, maybe a modest thing. I'm one of the most widely read columnists in the Arab Muslim world. That is not a natural thing. Okay. And by the way, I'm not out there saying you're all great, you're all wonderful, it's all the Israelis' fault. I'm actually in people's face a lot. But there's a couple things they know about me. And the first is, I really want them to succeed. I'm not there to put them down. I actually want them to succeed. And the second thing is, I'm a good listener. And being a good listener is really important for two reasons. The first is what you hear when you listen. Actually, you learn a lot when you listen. All the stories I got wrong were because I was talking when I should have been listening. But the second and much more important thing is what you say when you listen. What you say when you listen. Listening is a sign of respect. And it's amazing what people will let you say to them if they think you respect them. And if they think you don't respect them, you cannot tell them the sun is shining or there's clouds in the sky. But if people think you respect them, it's amazing what they will trust you to say to them. And so I spend a lot of time listening to people. And when I get done listening, I will tell them what I think. But they will know one thing, it comes because I want them to succeed, and that it comes out of respect. And that's why I recently changed my business card. It used to say Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times Foreign Affairs columnist. It now says Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times Humiliation and Dignity correspondent. Because I basically spent my entire career watching people acting out on their humiliation and questing for dignity. China, after a century, it called a century of humiliation. Russia, after the humiliation of losing the Cold War. Palestinians humiliated by Israelis. Muslim youth in Europe humiliated by the Christian majority there. All I have done for the last 40 years is basically cover people acting out on their humiliation and questing for dignity. And there's so many wounded people in the world today, feeling their dignity is wounded. And I was in Tahrir Square. When people said to me, what did you see there? I said, I saw a lot of young people who live in a flat world where they could see how everybody else was living and realizing they did not have the tools or the space to realize their full potential. And it was humiliating for them. And you could literally, talk to them and they would use that word dignity over and over and over again. So that's, there's no magic cure for building trust or method, but that's my method. I hope that helps.
Can I just build on your, I'll come to you, build on your point about the Islamic world,
Yeah.
One of the great paradoxes is why the Islamic world, which used, as you know, at one time, used to have civilizations as successful as other civilizations, Bassett and others. Why is it the Islamic world hasn't produced a Japan, a South Korea, a Singapore? Why haven't they? They're as talented as anybody else. What's really holding back that?
Well, first of all, Dubai has built itself around Singapore, and I would say Dubai is a pretty good imitation. So and Beirut in its heyday, but they will tell you they've asked the same question, And my answer again, because I depend so much on nature, Kishore, to understand the world. So I was at the Land Institute in Kansas. This is 7-8 years ago, 2008 actually. Which is trying to grow, it's an experimental farm that's trying to grow a perennial form of wheat, run by a famous biologist called Wes Jackson, MacArthur Award winner. And Wes was explaining to me the prairie. And the prairie was a polyculture of many plants and animals and insects. And Wes explained that when the Europeans came to the prairie, they plowed up a lot of it and replaced it with monoculture crops, wheat, corn, and sorghum. And to grow those monocultures in the prairie, they used enormous number of amounts of high-density fossil fuels, fertilizers, pesticides, and tractors. When the Dust Bowl happened, the entire array of monoculture crops all died. But the parts of the prairie they left all survived. So the monoculture died and the polyculture survived because the polyculture naturally pesticided itself, naturally fertilized itself, etc. So I use that as a metaphor for the world because the Arab Muslim world was at its height when it was a polyculture. More Spain. I mean, it was the carrier of the great thinking, of the Greeks, into modern Europe. And it was the world's biggest polyculture. Unfortunately, if you look at what did Al-Qaeda represent? It's a complete monoculture that wanted to wipe out every aspect of polyculture, every other faith, every other version of Islam, replace it with a monoculture, and who were they funded by? High-density fossil fuels. The Republican Party in America used to be an incredible polyculture. You had Northern Republicans and Southern Republicans, you had moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans. Today, it is an entire monoculture funded by high-density fossil fuels. So what's happened to what happened to the Arab Muslim world happened to the Republican Party, happened to the prairie. And so Singapore is so blessed. You're really, God blessed you. He blessed you with no high-density fossil fuels. And so
and a polyculture.
That's right. That's what I mean. Well, I think the polyculture was a byproduct of that because the only way you could thrive was by drilling your people and unlocking their creativity and talent, women and men, and not by drilling the ground. And so you are always in a state of constant renewal while other people are just praying that their monoculture resources don't die.
I like that analogy. In fact, just yesterday I mentioned to you, I was in Indonesia. And Indonesia is amazing. It's a remarkably successful society because of its polyculture too. So please, introduce yourself to, we want somebody from the theater world, so please.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Gaurav Kripalani. poli-sci student who now produces plays
I
and
should
musicals.
mention he's a
Great
fellow,
voice.
He's a fellow Sindhi.
Oh, really? Great.
Kishore and I are old friends. My question for you is really, what's your prediction for the future? What's 2050 look like? In 2004-5, you said the world is flat, what I loved, and you said 2007 the world reinvented itself. Will the world be flat again? What is the world? What to do all the wonderful things you talked about today? Today you showed the hockey graph curve. What is the future going to be for us?
Well, I really have always avoided predictions, and I wish I could do that. All I could tell you is, given the problems the world faces, climate change, managing these accelerations, global currency, global digital payments, the central sort of global issue is that we require now global governance on all these issues, and we have no global government. And to me, the number one determinant of whether the future will be better than the past is whether we can somehow find a way to overcome this tribalism that we're experiencing now. So we can produce cooperatively global governance when we have no global government. If we can do that, we can manage all these changes, all these accelerations, I believe. And if we can't, it's going to get very ugly, because Mother Nature, another teacher, Rob Watson, I refer to all these people as my teachers because they really are, and I'm so blessed to have an amazing network of people who I can call on. So Rob Watson's the guy who invented green buildings in America. And Rob likes to say that Mother Nature is just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't talk her up, you can't talk her down. You can't say Mother Nature. We in Singapore, we got a crazy neighbor who can't manage their smoke in the air, whatever. Can you do something about our neighbor? No. She's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And Mother Nature, to put it in American baseball terms, always bats last. And she always bats 1,000. Do not mess with Mother Nature. And that's what we're doing. And so unless we can come together, we're going to be a bad biological experiment, frankly. I look at what's going on in, let's take Yemen today. And I just say to these people, Mother Nature is going to kill you all so much faster than you kill each other, and no one is going to rebuild your country today. You know what I mean? So this is really interesting, your fight over who's the proper heir to the Prophet Muhammad from 623. But I'm telling you, if you don't overcome this, you're going to have a vast wasteland. And my prediction of the future is that there are going to be zones that overcome it, and there are going to be zones that don't. And therefore, this tension between the world of order and the world of disorder is going to get sharper. That's the negative. My positive hope is that we'll generate the leadership, to collaborate. Because without collaboration, without complex adaptive coalitions in an age of climate change at a global scale, there's no way to manage this. So that's been the message I've been trying to spread.
We have exactly 5 minutes. Does anybody have a really burning question you must ask before you leave the room? If not, I'm going to take one from the computer. You do? Oh, why don't you stand up and ask it, please? Because here it just says guest number so and so.
Okay, I had a submission when you were discussing this whole thing about China and the US and all that. And my submission is that, a lot of this is posturing, because, Donald Trump is not really serious about it.
Donald Trump is not really?
Is not really serious about it. What he's doing
Trump
is
not serious about it.
Oh.
It's not a strategy. He's just, throwing things at his base. And therefore, he doesn't want to find a solution. And the same applies the other side. I think you referred to, Xi Jinping, the popularity he has because people are rallying behind him because America is attacking them. So it's all about, posturing and, this. I mean, to me, the Chinese can buy him off by giving him 2 Trump towers, one in Beijing and one in Shanghai. But, they're not doing it, which means that they're not serious either. So what would you think?
I think there's some truth to what you say. Trump didn't approach this in any kind of strategic way. That you'd normally have taken 6 months. You'd have the Defense Department weigh in, the Commerce Department weigh in, USTR weigh in. I mean, look, the scary thing, I don't want to end on a down point, but I mean, just, I mean, I should have warned you, I can actually ruin any dinner party. And I do weddings and bar mitzvahs. So it's, you know, we think of Trump, there's a guy we call Secretary of State, someone we call President, Vice President, this and that. We're living in a freak show. People have no idea really how bad this is. We have a president who spends a lot of his day watching television, tweeting. He has an acting White House Chief of Staff, acting OMB director. Everybody's around him is just acting because we started with a few A players and a lot of B players. They're all gone, okay? Now we only have C players. And every one of them walked into their office by stepping over a dead body. And look, ooh, that had a Twitter knife in its back, okay? So, you're asking for strategy, and I'm just praying every night to get through the next year. Because this is a freak show. This is not a normal government. And unfortunately, our conservative party has gone completely off the rails. And we have people, and we have a network now, Fox News, that has created a hermetically sealed epistemological universe where a lot of the country has a completely different sense of the news than the rest of us. And so you cannot talk about this in normal government terms, you know, having a policy, having a meeting in the sit room where things are thought out, you know. And so, again, I just pray we're about a year. We just need to get through the year, you know, and hope that he is defeated. 4 years we can tolerate. 8 years, and the America you knew will be gone.
Yeah.
I say to Kishore, just to leave you all fully depressed, you know, our mutual friend, you know, Fareed Zakaria wrote a book about you know, the post-American world. And what he meant by that was actually a world where America would be geopolitically equal to others. But what if we have a post-American world where we have an America that simply is not itself anymore, is not a source of truth or trust, is not the standard bearer of what is true and right in the world, and is not a generator of global trust, but is in fact just the opposite, a generator of fake news and a generator of mistrust. Because that's what 4 more years of Trump, imagine 4 more years of Trump when he is not constrained by needing to get reelected. He will never answer another subpoena. And so the damage that will be done, and all I can say, and this is what I say to the people who are collaborating with him, the Devin Nunes's, the Lindsey Grahams. Do you people go home at night to some offshore island where none of this is going to matter to you or your kids or the country? Are you really doing this for $174,000 a year in salary and free parking at National Airport? Please tell me you're doing it for some other reason. Please tell me that you do go home to some offshore island, because I'd like to rent space there, okay? But if that's not the case, and I think I'll just end here, which is that I said this the other day, I'm a Wednesday columnist, have been since 1995, which means I get the first column after every election. So when the last election happened, so I had to write 3 columns in 2016. One slightly tilted toward Hillary, one neutral, and then one that Trump had won. But they all ended with a quote, or began with a quote from a friend of mine from Zimbabwe, Leslie Goldwasser, who said to me, "You Americans treat your country like it's a football. And you just kick it around like it's a football. It's actually not a football. It's a Fabergé egg. You can drop it and you can break it." And we have people treating America today as if our stability is just a given. So I can do anything I want to the system. I can have a president who tells, I don't know where the counter is right now, 14,000 falsehoods and lies, you know. I can stand in a committee and tell you that up is down and down is up, you know. and nothing will happen. Something will happen. We can drop it. We can break it. And just hold your breath in the next year that we don't do that.
So let me close with 3 thank yous, since I like 3 points. The first thank you is to all of you. I never thought you could have an audience that could sit there for 2 hours and actually listen and pay attention. I've been watching your eyes, and your eyes are open and you're all listening. So you've been a wonderful audience. My second thank you is to Lee Kuan Yew School for organizing this Festival of Ideas. It's obviously a great event, and this clearly has been one of the highlights. My third and most important thank you is to Tom, because there are very, very few people in the world who can speak for 2 hours and not put the audience to sleep. And he's clearly one of them. So well done, Tom.
You too.
No,